The year is 1964. American destroyers are patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. Suddenly, radar screens light up. Torpedoes in the water. North Vietnamese patrol boats are attacking. Or are they? This incident would become the justification for America's full-scale entry into the Vietnam War. But the truth is, the road to this moment began decades earlier, on the other side of the world, in the palaces of European colonial powers. To understand how the Vietnam War truly started, we need to go back, way back. This isn't a story that begins with American troops landing in Da Nang. This is a story about empires, independence, and a small nation that refused to be conquered no matter the cost. Our story begins in the 19th century. France was a global superpower, competing with Britain for colonial dominance. Africa, the Caribbean, the Pacific. European powers were carving up the world like a pie. And France had its eyes on Southeast Asia. Vietnam, at this time, was not the divided nation you might imagine. It was a unified kingdom with over 1,000 years of history. The Vietnamese had fought off Chinese invasions. They'd defeated Mongol hordes, not once, but 3 times. These people knew how to resist. But France wasn't interested in Vietnam's history or its culture. France saw rice, rubber, coal, tin, strategic ports along critical trade routes. In 1858, French naval forces attacked and captured the city of Da Nang. This was the beginning of a brutal conquest that would take decades. The Vietnamese fought back fiercely. Emperor Tu Duc tried to resist, but France had modern rifles, artillery, and warships. By 1884, after years of fighting, France forced Vietnam into submission. They combined Vietnam with neighboring Cambodia and Laos into a colonial territory they called French Indochina. Now here's what you need to understand about French colonial rule. This wasn't benevolent development. This was exploitation, pure and simple. The French took Vietnam's best agricultural land and turned it into massive plantations. Vietnamese peasants who had farmed their family land for generations suddenly found themselves working as laborers on French-owned rubber plantations. The French implemented a system of forced labor. They imposed heavy taxes that Vietnamese farmers could barely afford. They built infrastructure, sure, roads, railways, ports, but not for the benefit of the Vietnamese people. These were built to extract resources more efficiently and ship them back to France. Education was restricted. The French wanted enough educated Vietnamese to serve as low-level administrators and translators, but not enough to challenge French authority. Vietnamese culture was suppressed. The French language was imposed. Vietnamese who wanted to advance in society had to essentially become French in everything but blood. And the Vietnamese hated it. Resistance movements formed constantly. There were uprisings in 1885, in the 1890s, in the early 1900s. The French crushed each one with overwhelming military force. They executed resistance leaders. They burned villages suspected of harboring rebels. They ruled through fear and violence. But something was changing in the world. New ideas were spreading. Marxism, Leninism, nationalism, anti-colonialism. And these ideas were reaching Vietnam's young intellectuals. One of those young intellectuals was born in 1890 in central Vietnam. His birth name was Nguyen Sinh Cung, but the world would come to know him as Ho Chi Minh, and this man would change everything. Ho Chi Minh's father was a Confucian scholar and a Vietnamese nationalist who refused to serve the French colonial administration. This meant the family lived in poverty, but young Ho grew up with a deep sense of Vietnamese identity and resentment toward foreign occupation. In 1911, at age 21, Ho Chi Minh left Vietnam on a French freighter. He worked as a cook's helper and traveled the world. He lived in London. He moved to Paris. And in Paris, something crucial happened. It was 1919. World War I had just ended. American President Woodrow Wilson was promoting his 14 points, which included the principle of self-determination, the idea that people should have the right to choose their own government. Ho Chi Minh, going by the name Nguyen Ai Quoc at the time, tried to petition the Paris Peace Conference. He wanted to present a modest 8-point proposal asking for basic rights for the Vietnamese people, not independence, just rights. The Western powers ignored him completely. Wilson's principle of self-determination, it turned out, only applied to white Europeans. For colonized peoples in Asia and Africa, nothing. This rejection radicalized Ho Chi Minh forever. In 1920, Ho Chi Minh became a founding member of the French Communist Party. He traveled to Moscow. He studied revolutionary tactics. He became convinced that communism and nationalism could be combined into a powerful force to drive out the French and create an independent Vietnam. Meanwhile, back in Vietnam, resentment continued to build. The Great Depression of the 1930s hit Vietnamese peasants particularly hard. Prices for rice and rubber collapsed, but French colonial authorities still demanded the same taxes. Starvation became widespread in some regions. In 1930, Vietnamese communists organized the Yen Bay Mutiny, where Vietnamese soldiers in the French colonial army rebelled. The French crushed it brutally, executing dozens of rebels and imprisoning thousands more. But each act of repression only created more revolutionaries. By the late 1930s, war clouds were gathering again in Europe. Nazi Germany was rearming. Imperial Japan was expanding aggressively in Asia. And in 1939, World War II began. France declared war on Germany after the Nazi invasion of Poland. But in June 1940, Germany invaded France itself. In just 6 weeks, France fell. The government collapsed. The Nazis occupied northern France, while a puppet government was established in the south at Vichy. This changed everything for French Indochina. The colony was suddenly cut off from mainland France. And worse, there was a powerful, aggressive neighbor right next door: Imperial Japan. Japan had been fighting a brutal war in China since 1937. They needed resources: oil, rubber, rice, strategic bases. And French Indochina had all of that. With France defeated and Britain fighting for survival against Germany, Japan saw an opportunity. In September 1940, Japan demanded the right to station troops in northern Indochina and use it as a base for operations against China. The French colonial government was in an impossible position. They had no reinforcements coming from France. They were isolated. They had no choice but to agree. This created a bizarre situation. French colonial administrators remained technically in charge, but Japanese troops were everywhere, with real control. It was an occupation disguised as cooperation. For the Vietnamese people, this meant double oppression. French colonial authorities on one side, Japanese military on the other. Taxes increased, forced labor intensified. The Japanese military requisitioned massive amounts of rice to feed their armies fighting across Asia. And then came the famine. In 1944 and 1945, northern Vietnam experienced a catastrophic famine. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 1 and 2 million Vietnamese people starved to death. 1 to 2 million. Let that sink in. The causes were complex. There were bad harvests due to weather, but the primary cause was human policy. The Japanese had forced farmers to grow industrial crops like jute instead of rice. They requisitioned whatever rice was grown for military supplies. French colonial authorities did nothing to help. Peasants were dying in the streets while warehouses held rice reserves that could have saved them. This famine radicalized an entire generation of Vietnamese. It showed them, in the most brutal way possible, that foreign occupation meant death, that their lives meant nothing to their occupiers, that independence wasn't just a political ideal, it was a matter of survival, and Ho Chi Minh was ready to act. In May 1941, Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam after 30 years abroad. He was now 51 years old, a seasoned revolutionary with training from Moscow and decades of organizing experience. He gathered nationalist and communist groups together and formed a new organization, the Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Minh Hoi. In English, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. You know it better as the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh's goal was simple: fight the Japanese, fight the French, and create an independent Vietnam. They began organizing in the northern highlands, in remote mountain regions where French and Japanese control was weak. They recruited peasants who had lost family members to the famine. They trained guerrilla fighters. They built a revolutionary army from nothing. And here's where American policy enters the picture, in a way that would have ironic consequences decades later. The United States in 1945 was at war with Japan. American strategists were looking for any group that could fight the Japanese in Indochina and provide intelligence. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, precursor to the CIA, made contact with the Viet Minh. American officers met with Ho Chi Minh. They were impressed. He spoke perfect English. He seemed moderate and reasonable. He quoted the American Declaration of Independence. The Viet Minh provided intelligence on Japanese positions. They rescued downed American pilots. The OSS gave the Viet Minh weapons and training. American instructors taught Viet Minh fighters guerrilla tactics. Some OSS officers even parachuted into Viet Minh camps to coordinate operations. This cooperation was pragmatic, focused on defeating Japan, but it gave Ho Chi Minh hope that America might support Vietnamese independence after the war. After all, America itself had been a colony that fought for independence. President Roosevelt had spoken publicly about opposing the restoration of European colonial empires after the war. Ho Chi Minh believed, or at least hoped, that America would be different from the other great powers, that America would honor its own revolutionary ideals and support Vietnamese independence. He was wrong. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. World War II was over. In Vietnam, chaos erupted. The Japanese military, defeated and demoralized, essentially gave up. French colonial administrators, who had been imprisoned by the Japanese since March in a coup, had no forces to restore order. There was a power vacuum, and the Viet Minh moved fast. Within days, Viet Minh forces took control of city after city. In Hanoi, hundreds of thousands of people filled the streets in massive demonstrations. Red flags with yellow stars, the Viet Minh flag, appeared everywhere. The emperor, Bao Dai, who had been a puppet ruler under both the French and Japanese, abdicated and handed power to the Viet Minh. On September 2, 1945, in front of 500,000 people in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh declared independence. He read from a declaration he had written, and his first words were borrowed directly from Thomas Jefferson. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He continued, describing decades of French colonial oppression, listing grievances just as the American founders had done against the British. He declared the establishment of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The crowd erupted in celebration. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Vietnam might gain independence peacefully. American OSS officers were there at the ceremony. Some even stood on the platform with Ho Chi Minh. The Viet Minh controlled most of the country. The old colonial order had collapsed, but international politics was about to crush these hopes. While Ho Chi Minh was declaring independence in Hanoi, decisions made thousands of miles away were already sealing Vietnam's fate. The great powers were dividing up the post-war world, and Vietnam was just another piece on the chessboard. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the Allied powers had made arrangements for accepting Japan's surrender throughout Asia. For Indochina, they decided that British forces would accept surrender in the south, below the 16th parallel, while Chinese nationalist forces would handle the north. This decision would prove catastrophic. It divided Vietnam into two zones, creating a template that would eventually lead to permanent division. In the north, Chinese nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek poured across the border. About 200,000 Chinese troops occupied northern Vietnam. They looted systematically. They stripped factories of equipment to ship back to China. Vietnamese civilians who had just escaped famine now faced occupation by an army that treated them as conquered territory. But there was a silver lining for Ho Chi Minh. The Chinese nationalists hated the French even more than they disliked the communists. Chiang Kai-shek had no interest in helping France re-establish its colony. This gave the Viet Minh breathing room to consolidate control in the north. The situation in the south was completely different. British forces under General Douglas Gracie arrived in Saigon in September 1945. Gracie's orders were simply to maintain order and disarm the Japanese. But Gracie personally believed that European colonial empires should be preserved. So, he made a decision that changed history. He freed and rearmed French soldiers who had been imprisoned by the Japanese. He allowed them to overthrow the local Viet Minh administration in Saigon. When Vietnamese civilians protested, British and French forces fired into the crowds. This was a crucial turning point. The Viet Minh had taken power peacefully in the south, but now French troops, backed by British forces, were violently reimposing colonial control. Any chance of a peaceful transition to independence died in the streets of Saigon. Meanwhile, the French government was desperate to reassert control over Indochina. France had been humiliated by defeat in World War II. The country was economically devastated. French national pride had been shattered. Many French politicians believed that restoring the colonial empire, especially Indochina, was essential to France's recovery as a great power. In October 1945, French forces began arriving in Vietnam in larger numbers. France's most decorated general, Philippe Leclerc, arrived with orders to retake the colony. But France lacked the strength to do it alone. The country was bankrupt, still recovering from Nazi occupation. So France turned to Britain and America for help, and this is where Cold War politics entered the equation. By 1946, relations between the Soviet Union and the Western powers were deteriorating rapidly. Winston Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech. Soviet-backed communist governments were taking power in Eastern Europe. In China, Mao Zedong's communist forces were gaining ground against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. American policymakers were becoming obsessed with containing communism. The Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947, committed the United States to supporting free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. In practice, this meant opposing communist movements everywhere, regardless of local context. France exploited this emerging Cold War paranoia brilliantly. French officials portrayed the conflict in Vietnam not as a colonial war, but as part of the global struggle against communist expansion. They warned that if Vietnam fell to Ho Chi Minh's communists, all of Southeast Asia might follow, a theory that would later be called the domino theory. This argument worked. Despite America's traditional anti-colonial rhetoric, despite Roosevelt's earlier opposition to restoring European empires, the United States began supporting France's war in Vietnam. But I'm getting ahead of the story. Let's go back to 1946, because there was one last chance for peace. Ho Chi Minh was a pragmatist above all else. He understood that Vietnam couldn't fight both France and the emerging American-led Western Bloc. So he tried diplomacy. In March 1946, Ho Chi Minh negotiated an agreement with France. It was full of ambiguous language and compromises, but the basic deal was this. France recognized Vietnam as a free state within the French Union and Indochinese Federation. French troops would be allowed to return to northern Vietnam to replace the Chinese occupation forces. In return, France would hold a referendum on reunifying the North and South, and Vietnamese independence would be negotiated. Ho Chi Minh knew this was a bad deal. He was criticized by hardliners in the Viet Minh for selling out. But his logic was simple. It was better to let French troops in than Chinese troops, because eventually France could be defeated. China, as Vietnam's huge neighbor, was a permanent threat. For a few months, there was an uneasy coexistence. French and Viet Minh forces both occupied Hanoi. Ho Chi Minh even traveled to France for negotiations. He walked the streets of Paris. He gave interviews. He was treated as a legitimate political leader. But in Vietnam, tensions were rising. French military commanders on the ground had no intention of honoring any agreement that would grant real independence. They saw the March Agreement as a temporary tactic to get troops back into the country. The long-term goal remained clear: restore French colonial control completely. Incidents multiplied. French forces seized control of customs houses. They arrested Viet Minh officials. They occupied strategic points in major cities. The Viet Minh, watching French forces grow stronger, began preparing for war. The breaking point came in November 1946 in the northern port city of Haiphong. A dispute erupted over who controlled customs collection at the port. Vietnamese and French forces faced off. Then, on November 23rd, French naval forces issued an ultimatum to the Vietnamese forces to evacuate certain districts of Haiphong. When the Vietnamese didn't comply fast enough, French ships opened fire. The French cruiser Suffren and other ships bombarded Vietnamese neighborhoods of Haiphong with heavy artillery. French aircraft dropped bombs. Estimates of civilian deaths range from 6,000 to 20,000. The French military commander who ordered the bombardment, General Valois, had told his forces to teach a harsh lesson to the Vietnamese. They certainly did that. The massacre at Haiphong convinced even moderate Vietnamese nationalists that France had no intention of negotiating in good faith. War was now inevitable. On December 19, 1946, Viet Minh forces launched coordinated attacks on French positions throughout Hanoi and other cities in the north. The First Indochina War had begun. It's important to understand what this war looked like, because it set the pattern for everything that would follow 20 years later when Americans took over from the French. The French had superior conventional military forces. They had tanks, artillery, aircraft, a professional army. They controlled the cities and major roads. They assumed this would be a quick campaign to crush poorly armed guerrillas. But the Viet Minh didn't fight the way the French expected. Ho Chi Minh's top military commander was a former history teacher named Vo Nguyen Giap. Giap had no formal military training, but he had studied military history extensively, particularly Chinese communist guerrilla warfare theories. Giap understood that the Viet Minh couldn't win conventional battles against French armor and artillery. So, he avoided conventional battles. Instead, he developed a three-phase strategy. Phase 1, guerrilla warfare. Small units attack isolated outposts, ambush supply convoys, assassinate French collaborators, then disappear into the jungle or mountains. The goal wasn't to defeat the French army, but to survive, to bleed French forces, slowly to make occupation expensive and demoralizing. Phase 2, transitional warfare. As Viet Minh forces grew stronger, they would begin conducting larger operations involving multiple battalions, attacking French positions in coordinated strikes, then withdrawing before French reinforcements arrived. Phase 3, conventional warfare. Once the Viet Minh had built a true army with heavy weapons and training, they would challenge French forces in set-piece battles and drive them out of Vietnam entirely. This strategy required patience and enormous sacrifice. Giap was willing to accept casualties that would have been unthinkable to Western commanders. The Vietnamese population suffered terribly. But Giap understood something crucial. France was a democracy with public opinion to worry about. The French people had to support the war. Vietnamese people, fighting for their homeland, would endure far more suffering than French soldiers fighting in a colonial war thousands of miles from home. And Giap was right. Through 1947 and 1948, French forces won virtually every battle. They launched sweeps through the countryside, killing hundreds of Viet Minh fighters. They reoccupied town after town. French newspapers published optimistic reports about imminent victory. But the Viet Minh kept coming back. For every guerrilla killed, 2 more appeared. French casualty lists grew longer. The costs of the war mounted. And France, still recovering from World War II, was running out of money. This is when American aid became critical. Starting in 1950, the United States began providing massive military and economic assistance to France's war effort. Why? Because in 1949, everything had changed in Asia. Mao Zedong's communist forces won the Chinese Civil War. On October 1st, 1949, Mao declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China. The world's most populous nation had gone communist. American policymakers were shocked and frightened. China's loss to communism became a political catastrophe in Washington. Republicans blamed Democrats for failing to stop Mao. Politicians competed to prove who was tougher on communism. This was the beginning of the McCarthy era, where anyone suspected of being soft on communism faced career destruction. In this atmosphere, Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh were reinterpreted through a Cold War lens. It no longer mattered that the Viet Minh had started as a nationalist independence movement. It didn't matter that most Vietnamese supported them, because they fought foreign occupation, not because of communist ideology. All that mattered to American policymakers was that Ho Chi Minh was a communist, trained in Moscow, and now he had the backing of Communist China and the Soviet Union. And Ho Chi Minh did have that backing. In January 1950, both the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China officially recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. China began providing weapons, supplies, and training to the Viet Minh. Chinese military advisors crossed the border to help Giap's forces. With Chinese support, the Viet Minh grew dramatically stronger. They now had heavy weapons, mortars, machine guns, eventually even artillery. They had secure bases along the Chinese border where they could train and regroup. They were transforming from a guerrilla force into a real army. The United States responded by escalating aid to France. In 1950, America was providing about 15% of the costs of France's war in Vietnam. By 1954, America was paying nearly 80% of all French war costs. Think about that. The French were doing the fighting and dying, but American taxpayers were funding the war. America was being drawn deeper and deeper into Vietnam's conflict, and most Americans didn't even know it was happening. In June 1950, something happened that made American involvement even deeper. The Korean War began. When North Korea invaded South Korea, American leaders saw it as proof of a coordinated communist campaign to conquer Asia. Vietnam and Korea became linked in American strategic thinking as fronts in the same global struggle. President Truman sent troops to Korea and increased aid to French forces in Vietnam. The wars were different, but in Washington's mind, they were parts of the same battle. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, the war was entering a new phase. By 1950, Giap felt his forces were ready to move to phase 2 of his strategy. The Viet Minh began launching large-scale offensives. In October 1950, Giap attacked a string of French forts along the Chinese border. The Battle of Chao Bang resulted in a catastrophic French defeat. Entire French colonial units were destroyed. France lost 6,000 troops and massive amounts of equipment. It was France's worst colonial defeat since Montcalm died at Quebec in 1759. The French public was horrified. Newspapers began questioning whether Indochina was worth the price. But French military leaders insisted they could still win with more troops and more American aid. In 1951, France sent General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny to take command. De Lattre was charismatic and confident. He stabilized the military situation, built a defensive line around the Red River Delta, and launched counterattacks that inflicted heavy losses on Viet Minh forces. For a while, it looked like French strategy might work. Giap had perhaps moved to conventional warfare too soon. His forces took terrible casualties and failed attacks on French fortified positions. The war settled into a brutal stalemate. But de Lattre died of cancer in early 1952. Without his leadership, French strategy floundered. New commanders came and went. None could figure out how to defeat an enemy that controlled most of the countryside, had massive popular support, and could retreat to sanctuaries along the Chinese border whenever conventional battles went badly. French casualties mounted. By 1953, France had lost over 90,000 soldiers dead or missing in Indochina. The war was becoming deeply unpopular in France. The government was unstable. Politicians knew the French people wanted out of Vietnam, but no one wanted to be blamed for losing Indochina. And then came Dien Bien Phu. In 1953, a new French commander arrived in Vietnam with a bold plan. General Henri Navarre believed he had figured out how to defeat the Viet Minh. His strategy was to lure Giap's main force units into a major battle in a location where French firepower superiority could destroy them. Navarre chose a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam, near the border with Laos, called Dien Bien Phu. It was a small village in a valley surrounded by hills. Navarre's plan was to establish a major airbase there. French special forces would garrison the base. Supplies would be flown in. When Viet Minh forces inevitably attacked, French artillery and air power would slaughter them in the open. It seemed like a brilliant plan. French officers were confident. They remembered World War I, where superior firepower had dominated battlefields. They assumed the same principles would apply in Vietnam. In November 1953, French paratroopers dropped into Dien Bien Phu. Engineers arrived and built an airstrip. More troops flew in. Eventually, the French had over 10,000 soldiers in the valley. They built strong points on some of the lower hills and settled in, waiting for Giap to take the bait. Giap did take the bait, but not in the way the French expected. Giap understood he couldn't defeat French firepower in open battle, so he didn't try. Instead, he spent months preparing the battlefield in ways the French didn't think were possible. Giap mobilized tens of thousands of civilian porters to move supplies to Dien Bien Phu. They carried artillery pieces through jungle, up mountains, along trails the French thought were impassable. They disassembled large guns and carried them piece by piece. They moved at night to avoid French aircraft. Meanwhile, Chinese advisors helped the Viet Minh establish anti-aircraft positions around the valley. They taught Viet Minh gunners how to shoot down French supply planes. And most crucially, Giap's forces dug in on the hills surrounding the valley. They didn't just occupy the hills, they tunneled into them. They created vast networks of trenches and bunkers, using techniques that Chinese forces had perfected in the Korean War. When Giap was ready, he had over 50,000 Viet Minh troops surrounding Dien Bien Phu. He had artillery on the hills, hundreds of guns that the French didn't know existed until they started firing. He had anti-aircraft weapons that would make French supply flights extremely dangerous. The French garrison at Dien Bien Phu had walked into a trap. The battle began on March 13, 1954. Viet Minh artillery opened fire and immediately destroyed much of the French artillery. The French had positioned their guns in the open, assuming counter-battery fire from primitive guerrillas wouldn't be effective. They were catastrophically wrong. One French strongpoint fell in a single day. The French commander, Colonel de Castries, was stunned. His artillery chief was so shocked by the failure of French planning that he walked into his bunker and killed himself with a grenade. The French rushed reinforcements to Dien Bien Phu by parachute drops, but Viet Minh anti-aircraft fire made these increasingly costly. Supply drops often missed their targets and fell into Viet Minh hands. For 56 days, the battle raged. Viet Minh forces, using human wave tactics, slowly tightened their grip on the valley. French strongpoints fell one by one. Casualties mounted horrifically on both sides. The French government desperately requested American intervention. Would the United States send bombers to break the siege? Some American military leaders, including Admiral Radford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, actually proposed using atomic bombs to save the French garrison. President Eisenhower seriously considered direct American military intervention. He met with congressional leaders to discuss it, but key members of Congress, including Senator Lyndon Johnson, said they would only support intervention if America had allies, particularly Britain. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill refused. Britain had no appetite for another Asian war so soon after Korea. Without British support, Eisenhower decided the political risks of unilateral American intervention were too high. So, France fought alone, and France lost. On May 7, 1954, the remaining French forces at Dien Bien Phu surrendered. Over 2,000 French soldiers were dead. Nearly 12,000 more were captured and marched to prison camps, where many would die. Viet Minh casualties were even higher, perhaps 23,000 dead. But Giap had achieved a stunning victory. The psychological impact was enormous. France, a major European power, had been defeated decisively by an Asian revolutionary army. The myth of European military invincibility, already damaged by World War II, was shattered completely. French public opinion had had enough. The war had cost over 92,000 French military dead, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese dead, and billions of francs that France couldn't afford. The government that had been fighting the war collapsed. A new government came to power with a mandate: get out of Vietnam. By sheer coincidence, an international conference on Asian affairs was already scheduled to begin in Geneva, Switzerland, just one day after Dien Bien Phu fell. The timing couldn't have been more dramatic. The Geneva Conference of 1954 brought together representatives from France, the Viet Minh, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and China. The goal was to negotiate a settlement to the First Indochina War. The negotiations were complex and contentious. Ho Chi Minh's government expected to essentially dictate terms. After all, the Viet Minh controlled most of Vietnam and had just won a decisive military victory. They expected unification under their government. But international politics intervened again. The Soviet Union and China, surprisingly, pressured Ho Chi Minh to accept compromise. Why? Both communist powers were focused on other priorities. The Soviets wanted to reduce Cold War tensions in Europe. China wanted international recognition and American acceptance of Mao's government. So the Soviet and Chinese delegations urged Ho Chi Minh to accept a divided Vietnam as a temporary solution. They promised that Vietnam would be reunified soon through elections. Ho Chi Minh felt betrayed, but he had little choice. He was dependent on Soviet and Chinese support. The result was the Geneva Accords, signed in July 1954. Here's what they agreed to. First, Vietnam would be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. Viet Minh forces would regroup north of the line. French forces and Vietnamese who had collaborated with France would regroup south of the line. Second, the division was explicitly temporary. The accord stated clearly that the 17th parallel was a provisional military demarcation line and should not in any way be interpreted as constituting a political or territorial boundary. Third, nationwide elections would be held in July 1956, just 2 years away, to reunify the country under a single government. Fourth, neither zone would enter into military alliances or allow foreign military bases, except for a limited French presence that would be phased out. It seemed like a reasonable compromise that would lead to peaceful reunification. The Viet Minh would control the north. Elections in 2 years would almost certainly give them control of the south as well, since Ho Chi Minh was by far Vietnam's most popular political figure. But there was a critical problem. The United States refused to sign the Geneva Accords. American delegates attended the conference, but they wouldn't sign the final agreements. Why? Because Eisenhower's administration had already decided that under no circumstances could the United States allow Vietnam to come under communist control. And here's the key moment where American policy took the path that would lead to catastrophe. Rather than accept Ho Chi Minh's inevitable victory in free elections, the United States decided to create an anti-communist government in South Vietnam and prevent the elections from ever happening. Let me be clear about what this meant. The Geneva Accords were based on the principle that Vietnam was one country temporarily divided. Elections would reunify it, but American policymakers decided to treat the 17th parallel as a permanent border and to build South Vietnam into a separate nation that would never be allowed to vote for reunification. This violated both the letter and spirit of the Geneva Accords. But in Washington's Cold War logic, preventing communist expansion was more important than honoring international agreements. To lead this new South Vietnamese state, the United States chose a man named Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was a Vietnamese nationalist and a devout Catholic. He had opposed both French colonialism and the communists. He had spent years in exile, including time in the United States. He had connections to influential Americans, including Cardinal Spellman in New York and Senator Mike Mansfield. In June 1954, with American backing, Diem became Prime Minister of South Vietnam under Emperor Bao Dai. Within months, with American support, Diem staged a rigged referendum and declared South Vietnam a republic with himself as president. Now Diem had some genuine nationalist credentials. He wasn't simply an American puppet, but he had major problems as a leader. First, Diem was a northerner ruling in the South. He had limited support in the region. Second, Diem was a Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country. Only about 10% of Vietnamese were Catholic. Diem favored Catholics in government appointments, which created massive resentment. Third, Diem was autocratic and paranoid. He trusted almost no one outside his immediate family. His brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, became his chief political advisor. His brother's wife, Madame Nhu, wielded enormous influence. Another brother was Archbishop of Hue. Diem's government became a family dictatorship. Fourth, and perhaps most critically, Diem had no real base of popular support. He had been out of Vietnam for years. While Ho Chi Minh was a national hero who had declared independence and fought the French, Diem was an exile returning with American backing. Many Vietnamese saw him as a foreign imposition. But the United States poured support into Diem's government. Between 1954 and 1960, America provided over $1 billion in aid to South Vietnam. American military advisors arrived to train the South Vietnamese army. American economic advisors helped shape government policy. American CIA agents worked to undermine opposition to Diem. The CIA, under Colonel Edward Lansdale, conducted extensive operations to strengthen Diem's position. They launched propaganda campaigns portraying the Viet Minh as brutal communists who would persecute religious Vietnamese. They spread rumors of atrocities in the North. Some of these were true, The North Vietnamese government did conduct harsh land reform campaigns that resulted in thousands of executions of landlords. But many of the CIA's stories were exaggerated or fabricated. The propaganda had an effect. Nearly 1 million Vietnamese, mostly Catholics, fled from North Vietnam to the south in 1954 and 1955. The United States provided ships to transport them. This migration created a Catholic anti-communist constituency in the South that Diem could rely on. Meanwhile, about 90,000 Viet Minh soldiers and cadres went north, as required by the Geneva Accords. But the Viet Minh left behind secret networks in the South, perhaps 10,000 trained operatives who were ordered to hide their weapons, blend into the population, and wait for the elections that would reunify Vietnam. Those elections were supposed to happen in July 1956. As the date approached, it became clear that Ho Chi Minh would win overwhelmingly. Even Eisenhower admitted in his memoirs that if elections had been held, possibly 80% of the population would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh. So Diem, with full American support, simply refused to hold the elections. He argued that South Vietnam hadn't signed the Geneva Accords and wasn't bound by them. He claimed that free elections couldn't be held with communists in the North. This was the moment when the path to the American war in Vietnam became almost inevitable. By preventing elections and insisting on permanent division, the United States had created an artificial state in South Vietnam that could only exist with American military and economic support. It was a state that much of its own population saw as illegitimate, and the Viet Minh networks in the South, who had been waiting patiently for peaceful reunification, realized they had been betrayed. From 1954 to 1959, the situation in South Vietnam was relatively quiet. The Viet Minh cadres who had stayed behind in the South were under orders from Hanoi to wait. Ho Chi Minh's government was focused on consolidating control in the North and hoped that political pressure might still force elections. But Diem wasn't content with just preventing elections. He launched a campaign to eliminate all opposition in South Vietnam, communist or otherwise. He called this campaign Denounce the Communists. In practice, it meant hunting down anyone who had supported the Viet Minh against the French. Diem's security forces arrested tens of thousands of people. Many were executed, others disappeared into prisons. Some were undoubtedly genuine communists, but many were just nationalists, or people who had supported independence, or anyone Diem's paranoid regime saw as a threat. Diem also refused to implement meaningful land reform. The Viet Minh had given land to peasants in areas they controlled. Diem's government took much of this land back and returned it to landlords, many of whom were Catholics from the North. This created enormous resentment among the peasantry. In the villages of South Vietnam, people who had fought for independence now watched as the Saigon government, backed by Americans, arrested their neighbors and took their land. The resentment that had driven resistance against the French began building again against Diem. In the North, pressure grew on Ho Chi Minh's government to support armed struggle in the South. The Southern cadres who had stayed behind were being systematically hunted down. They sent desperate messages north, asking for permission to fight back. For years, Ho Chi Minh resisted. He knew that armed struggle would likely bring American military intervention. He hoped diplomatic and political pressure might still work. But by 1959, the situation was untenable. Thousands of Viet Minh veterans in the South had been killed or imprisoned. The networks they had carefully built were being destroyed. In January 1959, the North Vietnamese government made a fateful decision. They authorized Southern cadres to begin armed resistance against Diem's government. The goal, at this stage, was still modest: protect the revolutionary forces, assassinate particularly brutal local officials, demonstrate that Diem couldn't control the countryside. The attacks began small. A government official murdered in his home, an ambush of a South Vietnamese army patrol, a village chief known for torturing prisoners found dead. Diem called the insurgents Viet Cong, which roughly translates as Vietnamese communists. It was meant as an insult, but the name stuck. The Viet Cong would become the term Americans used for all insurgents in South Vietnam, whether they were actually communists or just opponents of Diem's regime. By 1960, the insurgency was growing rapidly. Diem's repression had created exactly what he feared: a widespread rural rebellion. In many villages, people supported the Viet Cong because the Viet Cong were the only ones fighting against a government they hated. The Viet Cong used classic guerrilla tactics. They attacked at night. They ambushed patrols on remote roads. They assassinated government officials and anyone who collaborated too closely with Saigon. Then, they disappeared into the jungle or blended back into villages. South Vietnam's army, trained by Americans for conventional warfare, didn't know how to fight this kind of enemy. Soldiers were afraid to patrol at night when the Viet Cong were most active. They stayed in their bases after dark. The Viet Cong called this "We Own the Night." In December 1960, the National Liberation Front was formed in South Vietnam. This was the political arm of the insurgency. The NLF claimed to represent all South Vietnamese who opposed Diem, not just communists. They promised land reform, an end to corruption, and eventually reunification with the North. The NLF's program was carefully designed to appeal to as many South Vietnamese as possible. Yes, it was directed from North Vietnam. Yes, communists held key positions, but it also included Buddhists, intellectuals, and non-communist nationalists. This broad base of support made the insurgency much harder to defeat than if it had been purely communist. In America, 1960 was an election year. Senator John Kennedy was running against Vice President Richard Nixon. Both claimed to be tough on communism, but Kennedy criticized the Eisenhower administration for allowing a missile gap to develop with the Soviets and for losing ground in the global struggle against communism. After Kennedy narrowly won the election, he came into office determined to prove he was strong on foreign policy. When he was briefed on Vietnam, his advisors painted a grim picture. The Diem government was losing control. The insurgency was spreading. If current trends continued, South Vietnam might collapse. Kennedy's worldview was shaped by Cold War thinking. He believed in the domino theory, that if one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow. He had written about this explicitly regarding Southeast Asia. If South Vietnam fell, he believed Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, and eventually Indonesia might follow. America couldn't allow this. But Kennedy also didn't want to send American combat troops to Vietnam. He had been a naval officer in World War II. He understood the cost of war. He was looking for a middle path, more support for South Vietnam, but stopping short of direct American combat involvement. Kennedy's solution was counterinsurgency. This was a fashionable military doctrine at the time, promoted by academics and military thinkers who argued that communist insurgencies could be defeated through a combination of military action against guerrillas, political reform to win popular support, and economic development to address root causes of discontent. It sounded great in theory. In practice, it required exactly what South Vietnam didn't have: a legitimate government that could win popular support. Nevertheless, Kennedy dramatically increased American involvement. In December 1960, there were about 900 American military advisors in South Vietnam. By the end of 1963, there would be over 16,000. These weren't just advisors sitting in offices. American helicopter pilots flew combat missions, technically with South Vietnamese soldiers aboard, but really controlling the operations. American Special Forces teams lived in rural areas, training local militias. American intelligence officers planned operations. Americans were fighting and dying in Vietnam, but it wasn't officially called a war. Kennedy also authorized an ambitious program called the Strategic Hamlet Program. The idea was to move rural Vietnamese into fortified villages where the government could protect them from the Viet Cong and provide services that would win their loyalty. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it was a disaster. Peasants were forced from their ancestral villages, away from family burial grounds that held profound spiritual significance. They were moved into these strategic hamlets, which were often just prison camps with barbed wire and guard towers. The promised services rarely materialized. People resented being uprooted from their homes at gunpoint. The Strategic Hamlet Program ended up driving more people to support the Viet Cong than it won over to the government. The Viet Cong easily infiltrated the hamlets or attacked them at night. The program eventually collapsed, but not before creating enormous bitterness. Meanwhile, Diem's government was becoming increasingly dysfunctional. His paranoia grew worse. He trusted fewer and fewer people. Real decision-making was limited to his immediate family. himself, his brother Nu, and Madame Nu. Madame Nu was particularly problematic. She pushed through morality laws that banned dancing, beauty pageants, and other activities she considered decadent. She gave inflammatory interviews to Western journalists where she appeared callous about Buddhist concerns. She alienated the South Vietnamese elite and horrified American officials trying to maintain support for Diem's regime. But the real crisis came from Diem's treatment of Buddhists. Remember, most South Vietnamese were Buddhist, but Diem's government was dominated by Catholics. This created a built-in tension that Diem's policies made much worse. In May 1963, a crisis erupted in the city of Hue. It was Buddha's birthday, and Buddhists wanted to fly religious flags during celebrations. But Diem's government had a law against flying any flags except the South Vietnamese national flag. When Buddhists protested, government troops fired into the crowd, killing 9 people, including children. Diem's government refused to take responsibility or apologize. Instead, they blamed the Viet Cong for the deaths, an obvious lie that no one believed. This sparked a wave of Buddhist protests across South Vietnam. Monks organized demonstrations. They gave speeches criticizing the government. And on June 11, 1963, something happened that shocked the world. A Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc sat down at a busy Saigon intersection. Other monks poured gasoline over him. He struck a match and set himself on fire. Malcolm Brown, an Associated Press photographer, captured the moment. The photograph of the burning monk sitting in perfect stillness as flames consumed him became one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. It appeared on front pages around the world. This was a religious and political statement that couldn't be ignored. Buddhists were literally burning themselves to death to protest Diem's government. More monks would follow. Eventually, 6 monks self-immolated in 1963. And how did Diem's government respond? Madame Nu gave an interview where she mockingly called the self-immolations barbecues and offered to provide matches for more. The callousness was breathtaking. Even Diem's strongest American supporters realized the regime had become a liability. Kennedy's administration was now in an impossible position. They had invested enormous resources and prestige in supporting Diem, but Diem's government was collapsing politically, even as it faced a growing military insurgency. American officials couldn't get Diem to reform, couldn't get him to reconcile with the Buddhists, couldn't get him to remove his brother and sister-in-law from positions of influence. In Saigon, American Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge began meeting with South Vietnamese generals who were plotting a coup. The generals wanted to know, if they overthrew Diem, would the United States support them? This was an agonizing decision for Kennedy. Supporting a coup meant abandoning a man America had backed for 9 years. It meant admitting the policy had failed, and there was no guarantee that whoever replaced Diem would be any better. But Kennedy's advisors argued that Diem had to go. The regime was doomed. Better to have a coup now, with some American control over the transition, than to have a chaotic collapse later. On August 24, 1963, the Kennedy administration sent a cable to Ambassador Lodge that would change everything. The cable authorized Lodge to tell the Vietnamese generals that the United States would not oppose a coup against Diem if it had a reasonable chance of success. The generals began their final planning, but they moved cautiously because coups are risky. If it failed, Diem would have them executed. They needed to be sure of American support. The weeks dragged on through September and October. Kennedy grew frustrated with the generals' hesitation. Some of his advisors began to have second thoughts. Was supporting a coup the right decision? But in South Vietnam, events were moving forward. On November 1, 1963, South Vietnamese generals launched their coup. Army units surrounded the presidential palace in Saigon. Diem and Nu were trapped inside. Diem tried frantically to reach Ambassador Lodge by phone, asking about American support. Lodge was coldly non-committal. Diem realized he had been abandoned. That night, Diem and Nu escaped through a tunnel to a Catholic church in the Chinese quarter of Saigon, where they planned to hide. But they were discovered. On the morning of November 2nd, soldiers arrested them. The brothers were put in the back of an armored personnel carrier. Official reports would later say they committed suicide. In reality, they were almost certainly murdered during the transport, shot and stabbed to death. When Kennedy was informed of Diem's death, according to witnesses, he was shocked and disturbed. He had approved the coup, but not murder. Some historians argue Kennedy later regretted the decision to overthrow Diem, though we'll never know for certain what he really thought. Because 3 weeks later, on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Vice President Lyndon Johnson became president. Johnson inherited a mess in Vietnam that was about to get much worse. Lyndon Johnson was a master of domestic politics, but had limited foreign policy experience. His passion was creating the Great Society, ambitious programs to fight poverty, expand education, ensure civil rights. Vietnam was a distraction from what he really wanted to accomplish. But Johnson was also a politician shaped by the McCarthy era and the loss of China recriminations. He knew that if he lost South Vietnam to communism, Republicans would crucify him politically. His Great Society programs would die in Congress. His presidency would be destroyed. So Johnson felt trapped. He couldn't afford to lose Vietnam. But he also couldn't afford to fully commit to winning, because that might require a level of military involvement that could spark World War III with China or the Soviet Union. His solution was to try to do just enough to avoid losing, while hoping that somehow the situation would stabilize. This middle path, neither winning nor losing, just endlessly continuing, would define America's strategy for years and ultimately lead to catastrophe. When Johnson took office, South Vietnam was in chaos. The coup had removed Diem, but it didn't solve any of South Vietnam's fundamental problems. In fact, it made things worse in the short term. The generals who overthrew Diem immediately began fighting among themselves for power. There was a coup in January 1964, another coup in September 1964, more coups in 1965. South Vietnam went through a dizzying succession of military governments, none of which had legitimacy or popular support. During this chaos, the Viet Cong insurgency expanded dramatically. By mid-1964, the Viet Cong controlled large portions of the South Vietnamese countryside. They moved almost freely in many provinces. South Vietnamese military units were suffering defeat after defeat. American military advisors sent increasingly desperate reports to Washington. South Vietnam was losing the war. Without major American intervention, the Saigon government would collapse within months. Johnson's advisors were divided. Some, like Undersecretary of State George Ball, argued that Vietnam was a lost cause, and America should find a way to withdraw before getting in deeper. Others, particularly military leaders and hawks like Walt Rostow, insisted that American credibility was at stake. If the United States abandoned South Vietnam, allies around the world would question American commitment. Enemies would be emboldened. Johnson sided with the hawks, but he needed a way to escalate American involvement without looking like the aggressor. He needed a clear justification that would win congressional and public support for expanding the war. He found it in the Gulf of Tonkin. In August 1964, American destroyers were conducting intelligence-gathering patrols in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. These were called DeSoto patrols, and they had been happening for months. The destroyers would sail close to North Vietnamese coastal installations, provoking radar and communications emissions that American intelligence could collect. On August 2, 1964, the destroyer USS Maddox was conducting one of these patrols when 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats approached. The Maddox was in international waters, but the North Vietnamese may have believed it was supporting South Vietnamese commando raids on their coast that had occurred the previous night. The torpedo boats attacked. The Maddox returned fire with its 5-inch guns and called for air support from a nearby aircraft carrier. American F-8 Crusader jets arrived and strafed the North Vietnamese boats. One boat was severely damaged. The other 2 retreated. There were no American casualties. This was the first incident. The North Vietnamese had attacked an American ship in international waters. It was a clear case of North Vietnamese aggression, though the context of American covert operations and intelligence gathering was conveniently left out of public statements. Johnson ordered the patrols to continue. On the night of August 4th, the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, were patrolling in rough seas during a thunderstorm. Sonar operators reported what they thought were torpedo attacks. The ships took evasive maneuvers and fired hundreds of shells at radar and sonar contacts. But here's the problem. There probably wasn't actually a second attack. The sonar operators were likely hearing echoes from their own ship's propellers in the stormy seas. Radar was picking up false returns from the weather. The commander of the Maddox, Captain John Herrick, sent a message expressing doubts that any attack had occurred. But in Washington, Johnson and his advisors chose to believe there had been a second attack. Why? Because it gave them the justification they needed. As Johnson went on national television, he announced that North Vietnam had committed unprovoked aggression against American ships in international waters. In response, he had ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese patrol boat bases and oil storage facilities. Then Johnson asked Congress to pass a resolution giving him authority to take all necessary measures to defend American forces and assist Southeast Asian allies. This became known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The resolution passed almost unanimously. In the House of Representatives, the vote was 416-0. In the Senate, only 2 senators voted against it, Wayne Morse of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska. Both warned that the resolution was essentially a blank check for war. Both were ignored. Johnson now had congressional authorization to escalate American involvement in Vietnam however he wanted, and he wasn't the kind of person who hesitated to use power once he had it. But through the rest of 1964, Johnson moved cautiously. It was an election year. He was running against Republican Senator Barry Goldwater, who was campaigning as a hawk who would dramatically escalate in Vietnam. Johnson positioned himself as the peace candidate. He promised that American boys wouldn't be sent to do the fighting that Asian boys should do. It was all political theater. Johnson had already decided to escalate. He was just waiting until after the election. In November 1964, Johnson won in a landslide, carrying 44 states. Now he was free to do what he had been planning all along. In February 1965, the Viet Cong attacked an American base at Pleiku in the Central Highlands, killing 8 Americans and wounding over 100. Johnson used this as justification for Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Rolling Thunder would continue, with brief pauses, for over 3 years. American aircraft dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than had been dropped on Germany in all of World War II. The goal was to break North Vietnam's will to continue supporting the insurgency in the South. It didn't work. North Vietnam's economy was primitive and agricultural. There weren't many industrial targets worth bombing. The North Vietnamese moved what little industry they had underground or into caves. They used massive amounts of Chinese and Soviet aid to repair damaged infrastructure. And the bombing, rather than breaking their will, strengthened their resolve and gave them powerful propaganda about American barbarism. But bombing alone wasn't changing the situation on the ground in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces were getting stronger. South Vietnamese units were collapsing. American bases were being attacked. In March 1965, Johnson made the fateful decision to send American combat troops to Vietnam. The 1st Marines landed at Da Nang on March 8, 1965. Officially, they were there just to defend American bases. But mission creep was inevitable. By June, American troops were being sent on search and destroy missions into the countryside. By December 1965, there were nearly 200,000 American troops in Vietnam. That number would keep climbing. 385,000 by the end of 1966. 485,000 by the end of 1967, over 500,000 by 1968. The American way of war in Vietnam was based on attrition. The strategy, developed by General William Westmoreland, commander of American forces, was simple. Find the enemy, fix them in place, and destroy them with overwhelming firepower. Use helicopters for mobility. Use artillery and airstrikes for firepower. Eventually, the communists would run out of troops and be forced to negotiate. This strategy had several fatal flaws. First, it assumed the communists had a breaking point in terms of casualties they would accept. They didn't. Ho Chi Minh famously said that for every American killed, 10 Vietnamese would die, but the Americans would eventually leave while the Vietnamese would still be there. Second, attrition strategy meant American units went out on patrols looking for enemy forces in jungles and mountains. But the communists controlled when and where battles happened. They could attack from ambush, inflict casualties, then fade away before American firepower could be brought to bear. This meant Americans were always reacting, never controlling the battlefield. Third, The massive use of artillery and bombing created enormous civilian casualties. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were destroyed. The phrase, "we had to destroy the village in order to save it," became infamous. This created more enemies. Every civilian killed had family members who might join the insurgency for revenge. Fourth, there was no way to measure progress. Territory wasn't being captured and held. American units would fight for a hill, take it at great cost, then abandon it and move on to the next operation. So, the military invented the body count as a metric of success. Units reported how many enemy soldiers they'd killed. Promotions and praise went to commanders who produced high body counts. This created perverse incentives. Unit commanders inflated their body counts to look successful. Anyone killed in an operation might be counted as Viet Cong. Civilians were sometimes killed deliberately to boost numbers. The body counts reported to Washington bore little resemblance to reality. Meanwhile, North Vietnam was adjusting its strategy. By late 1965, regular North Vietnamese army units were infiltrating South Vietnam in large numbers. They used the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of paths and roads running through Laos and Cambodia, to move troops and supplies south. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was one of the great logistical achievements of the war. It started as primitive jungle paths, but over the years it was developed into a sophisticated network with underground fuel pipelines, hospitals, and supply depots. Thousands of Vietnamese worked full-time maintaining and defending the trail. American aircraft dropped enormous tonnage of bombs trying to cut the trail, but it was like trying to stop water flowing downhill. The North Vietnamese simply repaired damage overnight and kept supplies flowing. Eventually, they even got trucks and heavy equipment moving down the trail. The combination of Viet Cong guerrillas and North Vietnamese regulars gave communist forces multiple options. They could fight conventional battles when advantageous, or fade into guerrilla warfare when American firepower was too overwhelming. For American soldiers, Vietnam was a nightmare. Unlike World War II, where front lines were clear and progress was measurable, Vietnam had no front lines. The enemy could be anywhere. That farmer working his rice paddy during the day might be planting booby traps at night. That village might be friendly, or it might be a Viet Cong base. There was no way to tell until you were being shot at. The jungle itself was hostile. Troops dealt with heat, humidity, leeches, mosquitoes carrying malaria, snakes, and terrain that made movement exhausting. They carried heavy loads, weapons, ammunition, food, water, through mountainous jungle in temperatures over 100 degrees. And unlike previous wars, soldiers didn't deploy with their units for the duration. Instead, individuals served one-year tours, then rotated home. This meant units constantly lost experienced soldiers and gained inexperienced replacements. It also meant that soldiers focused on personal survival rather than unit cohesion or mission accomplishment. Your goal was to survive your year and go home. Taking unnecessary risks made no sense. The war was also controversial at home in ways previous American wars hadn't been. By 1965, the anti-war movement was growing. College students protested, clergy spoke out, folk singers wrote protest songs, draft card burnings made headlines. Johnson tried to downplay the war's costs and implications. He didn't want war funding to interfere with his Great Society programs, so he didn't ask for major tax increases or mobilize the economy for war. He just kept slowly escalating, always hoping that a bit more pressure would force North Vietnam to negotiate. This approach satisfied no one. Hawks wanted full mobilization and an all-out effort to win. Doves wanted withdrawal. Johnson's middle path meant a war that dragged on without resolution. By 1967, over 11,000 Americans had been killed in Vietnam. The weekly casualty lists were growing longer. Television news showed graphic combat footage nightly, and Johnson kept insisting that progress was being made, that there was light at the end of the tunnel, that victory was near. Most Americans still supported the war effort, but doubts were growing. Was this war really necessary? Could it actually be won? Was the Saigon government worth defending? These questions didn't have good answers. And then came 1968, the year that broke Lyndon Johnson's presidency and shattered American confidence in the war. As 1967 ended, General Westmoreland was assuring Washington that the war was being won. Communist forces were taking unsustainable casualties. The crossover point, where they were losing troops faster than they could replace them, had been reached. Victory was just a matter of time. In late January 1968, this optimistic assessment exploded in the most dramatic way possible. January 30th was Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the most important holiday in Vietnamese culture. There was supposed to be a ceasefire. Instead, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese launched coordinated attacks on over 100 cities and military bases throughout South Vietnam. The scope was stunning. Communist forces attacked the American embassy in Saigon. Sappers blew a hole in the embassy wall and fought inside the compound for 6 hours before being killed. It was broadcast live on American television. Viewers watched Marines fighting guerrillas on the embassy lawn, the supposed symbol of American power in Vietnam. In Hue, the old imperial capital, North Vietnamese forces captured most of the city and held it for 25 days. Brutal urban combat raged street by street. When American and South Vietnamese forces finally retook the city, they discovered mass graves. The communists had executed thousands of civilians they considered government collaborators. At Khe Sanh, a marine base near the Laotian border, 20,000 North Vietnamese troops laid siege. For 77 days, Marines held out under constant artillery bombardment, while American aircraft dropped thousands of tons of bombs on surrounding hills. It was compared to Dien Bien Phu, and there were genuine fears the base might fall. All across South Vietnam, fighting raged for weeks. American and South Vietnamese forces eventually pushed back the offensive. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a defeat for the communists. They had hoped South Vietnamese people would rise up and join them. That didn't happen. They took horrific casualties. Estimates suggest over 50,000 communist troops were killed. The Viet Cong was shattered as an effective fighting force. From this point on, the war would be fought primarily by North Vietnamese regulars. But Tet was a massive psychological and political victory for North Vietnam. Everything American officials had been saying, that the communists were defeated, that victory was near, that the war was being won, was revealed as false. If the enemy was so weak, how could they launch attacks in every major city simultaneously? American television news, which had been generally supportive of the war effort, turned critical. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted newsman in America, went to Vietnam after Tet. On February 27, 1968, he concluded his report by saying, "It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion." When Johnson watched Cronkite's broadcast, he reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Public opinion was shifting rapidly. Before Tet, a majority of Americans supported the war. After Tet, support collapsed. The anti-war movement, previously confined largely to young people and intellectuals, spread to mainstream America. And Johnson was facing a political crisis. Senator Eugene McCarthy, running as an anti-war candidate, nearly defeated Johnson in the New Hampshire primary in March 1968. Then Robert Kennedy, the late president's brother, announced his own anti-war candidacy. Johnson realized he might not even win his own party's nomination. On March 31, 1968, Johnson went on national television to announce a partial bombing halt as an attempt to start peace negotiations. Then, in a stunning conclusion to his speech, he announced, "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." The president who had escalated American involvement to over 500,000 troops, who had committed American prestige to preventing a communist victory, was giving up. Vietnam had destroyed his presidency, but the war went on, and it would get worse before it got better. Vice President Hubert Humphrey became the Democratic nominee for president. He was challenged by Robert Kennedy until Kennedy was assassinated in June 1968. The Democratic convention in Chicago descended into chaos, with police battling anti-war protesters in the streets, while delegates fought inside the hall. Republican Richard Nixon won the presidency, promising a secret plan to end the war. In reality, Nixon's plan was Vietnamization, gradually turning the fighting over to South Vietnamese forces while slowly withdrawing American troops. But he would also dramatically expand the war into Cambodia and Laos, and he would continue fighting for 4 more years before finally reaching a peace agreement. American troops wouldn't fully withdraw until 1973. Saigon would fall to North Vietnamese forces in April 1975. By then, over 58,000 Americans were dead. Estimates of Vietnamese deaths, soldiers and civilians, north and south, range from 1 to 3 million. So, how did the Vietnam War start? The simple answer is that it started with French colonialism, continued through World War II and Cold War politics, and escalated because American leaders couldn't distinguish between Vietnamese nationalism and global communist expansion. At every step, there were decision points where different choices might have avoided catastrophe. If France had granted independence peacefully after World War II, if the Geneva Accords elections had been held in 1956, if the United States had accepted neutralization of Vietnam instead of insisting on an anti-communist government in the South, if Kennedy hadn't supported the coup against Diem, if Johnson had listened to advisors who warned Vietnam was unwinnable, but at each point, the momentum toward war seemed irresistible. Domestic politics, Cold War ideology, bureaucratic momentum, and simple human stubbornness kept pushing toward deeper involvement. The tragedy of the Vietnam War is that it was avoidable. It wasn't the result of one dramatic moment or one terrible decision. It was the result of hundreds of small decisions, each seeming reasonable at the time, that accumulated into catastrophe. French officials couldn't imagine giving up their colonial empire. American officials couldn't imagine losing Vietnam to communism. Both underestimated Vietnamese determination to control their own country, regardless of the cost. And that determination, the willingness to endure unimaginable suffering for independence, is what ultimately decided the war. It wasn't American firepower or French military technology. It was the fact that the Vietnamese were fighting for their homeland, while foreigners were fighting for abstractions like credibility and containing communism. Ho Chi Minh understood this from the beginning. In 1946, when war with France was becoming inevitable, he told a French official, "You can kill 10 of my men for every one I kill of yours, but even at those odds, you will lose and I will win." He was right. The Vietnam War teaches us that military power has limits, that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes, that understanding history and culture matters at least as much as military strength, that when you're fighting people in their own country for a cause they believe in, all the technology and firepower in the world might not be enough. These lessons were bought at a terrible price. Millions of lives, a generation of Americans traumatized, a superpower's confidence shattered. The question is whether we've actually learned them. So, there you have it. The complete story of how the Vietnam War started, from 19th century colonialism to 1960s American escalation. From Ho Chi Minh's early nationalism to the Tet Offensive that broke American will. It's a complicated story without easy villains or heroes. Just human beings making decisions based on incomplete information, ideological assumptions, political pressures, and the persistent belief that just a little more force would finally achieve victory. If you found this deep dive valuable, make sure to like and subscribe. Drop a comment below telling me what other historical topics you'd like to see covered. And remember, the purpose of studying history isn't just to learn what happened. It's to understand why it happened. So maybe, just maybe, we can avoid making the same mistakes again. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.